Hello, good evening, everybody, or wherever you are in the world. And I'm delighted to have Kevin back. I've been on the road for a bit, and we are resuming our Saturday night series, which everyone that's tuning in, we really appreciate the community we've built here with you guys and Kevin. And Kevin really appreciates you supporting his work, clicking on his links, and reading his books, in which there are way more details than you're hearing on these streams. And I also want to give a shout out to Emma on the Imagination podcast. She's just done a 2 hour one with Kevin, Mind Controlled Culture, Why and How It Was Created. So I would urge people to check that one out as well. Now, many of you are fascinated by MK Ultra. We had O'Neill on years ago who wrote the book about MK Ultra and the Manson family chaos. And, it's just to think that our own governments and hierarchies, and in this case, we're focusing on royal, Vatican, and military mind control, that they continue these experiments to this day, and they can do the most horrific things to people in the name of national security, because if they don't have the edge on the other countries of the world, then the other countries of the world are going to conquer us, or whatever justification they've got. The communists are coming, the domino effect that authorizes us to find vulnerable people, push them to the brink of insanity by hugely torturous experiments. Kevin was on the podcast. Kevin was talking about kids getting thrown in the snow and people getting things stuck up their noses and things put in their brains, and it's absolutely diabolical that our governments can get up to this. But anyway, Kevin is going to expand on this for us. And Kevin, thank you for coming on. Should we just go over some of the basics? Because I imagine some of the viewers are not familiar with MK Ultra, and you're steeped in the history of it, the Nazis, etc.
Yeah, well, I mean, the term was kind of popularized, like many things, like Fort Detrick, Maryland, named after a Nazi scientist, brought over under Project Paperclip after the war. And MK Ultra was supposed to refer to mind control in German, MK, German, Ultra. And that's because the early experiments were pioneered by not only the Nazis, but just like with the sterilization and the eugenics movement to create a so-called master race, it actually originated among American psychiatrists in the late 19th century. And the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin picked it up, and the Nazis popularized it in that. So there was this kind of like transatlantic community of mind controllers and eugenicists working, on this whole thing. But it became huge and went into overdrive right after World War II. As part of the Cold War environment created the perfect cover and camouflage, in the same way churches provide camouflage for a lot of these crimes. And under the guise of that, it became a major industry, and it's still thriving because it's tied into human trafficking, the whole culture of silence and that around all these heinous crimes that we've been documenting. So yeah, it's definitely that's the general context for all of it we're going to talk about.
And years ago, when I read about it in a David Icke book, I thought this was preposterous. But in this day and age, MK Ultra now has its own wiki page, and it confirms. It starts out saying MK Ultra was an illegal human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency to develop procedures and identify drugs that could be used during interrogations to weaken individuals and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture. The term MK Ultra is a CIA cryptonym. MK is an arbitrary prefix standing for the Office of Technical Service, and Ultra is an arbitrary word out of a dictionary used to name this project. The program has been widely condemned as a violation of individual rights and an example of the CIA's abuse of power, with critics highlighting its disregard for consent and its corrosive impact on democratic principles. There's pages and pages and pages of it on Wiki now. And what first brought it to your attention, Kevin, in your own field?
Well, I'll tell about that momentarily, but what I wanted to comment on that was that that's a classic government spin description. It makes it seem like it's a very narrow thing that happened in the past, and now we've acknowledged it and we're moving on, right? it was much broader than that, and it wasn't about simple interrogation. It was basically the military and government agenda was, how did you create the perfect robot, the unthinking soldier who is devoid of emotion and critical thinking and will obey orders that have application for government, any ruler anywhere, but also the military, especially them. So it is a much broader thing than it's described there. The way I found out about it first, not only, like a lot of us, we have contact with this in everyday life, and even meeting people who've been through these things, where they often don't have a lot of memory of it. But I had the fortunate background of being, well, before I went into the ministry back in the 1980s, I paid my way through university by working in the University Psychiatric Hospital, University of British Columbia, as a psych assistant, and also in the community mental health field. So I worked in halfway houses. And from people on the ground, I began to learn, this is like 40 years ago, people who had been through these programs, not only electric shock, sensory deprivation, and all this stuff, but hearing a lot of other strange things. I remember back in the 80s, I helped form a coalition to stop the formation of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which is like Canada's so-called version of the CIA, because they were operating under completely illegal secret legislation that nobody could know about. They weren't accountable in that. And in one of our rallies in Vancouver to oppose CSIS, a woman came in, she had this metal foil around her head. And she said, well, it's to stop the directed energy weapons. And everyone was kind of laughing, because at that point we thought, okay, here's a crazy thinking she's being beamed. But as it turns out, she had been a survivor of one of these things. And she's the first person I ever heard that term from, directed energy weapons. So here's a kind of that's almost a metaphor for the situation we're in. Survivors are everywhere around us. And the evidence is all out there. It's just the believability and where do you take it, when you have this knowledge. So that was a great springboard into when I got to Port Alberni and began to work with Native people. Then the comments people were making to me when they were describing having gone through these death camps they call residential schools, almost every one of them would describe cultic aspects to what had happened to them. Children disappearing, being kept off in isolated rooms, ceremonies outside, Indian hospitals attached to the residential schools where children who spoke their own language would go in and be sterilized or be used in medical experiments. All of those stories were coming out along with everything I began to document as far back as 1992 when I began ministry there in Port Alberni. So it was a kind of plunge in the deep end on this stuff. If you work in a community like with Native people or any disenfranchised group, the evidence is everywhere in people's lives. We even began to get documentation of this from people, maverick investigators and that, who, when they heard about me in the press, would come to me with reams of evidence, stuff that had been, like with the residential school crimes, buried and just resurfaced by individuals, So that's kind of initially how I began to get into this latest aspect of it.
Right? People are asking about survivors. I did interview Anna Lee, who was an MK Ultra tunnel survivor. The link for that podcast is in the description box, and I'll put it in the live chat. And someone just asked about Manson and that. In O'Neill's book, he's showing how Manson, who'd done horrific crimes, anal, R-word of a teenage girl, for example, and a plethora of other stuff, and just repeatedly they just released him and the Manson family because his handlers had him in this MK Ultra experiment whereby they wanted to destroy the view of the positive, peaceful hippie, the war protesting hippie. They wanted to spoil that, and they knew if they put rats and mice on not just LSD but meth combined, they would form marauding troops of assaulters, sexual assaulting rodents and cannibal rodents, and they would, all this mayhem would result. And basically that's what they did with the Manson family, folks. They put them on the amphetamines and the LSD and just unleashed them on society. So it was an MK Ultra experiment that worked out perfectly for the government. People think it was out of control, but it wasn't. They were allowed over and over again to get out of all of the charges. until it got to the point where they just went absolutely on a murderous rampage.
Right.
And Kevin, you were giving some frightening examples in your interview with Emma. Do you want to expand on some of those, like the kids getting thrown in the snow, etc.?
Yeah, well, just before that, I wanted to comment on the whole Manson thing, because I was actually approached not too long ago by a former CSIS agent called Grant Wakefield, who had been investigating the connection between serial killing and these experiments. He got tossed out of CSIS for doing that. They tried to put him in a psych ward himself, the usual thing they do. But he said he found that there was a definite connection. And in fact, there was a notorious serial killer of children called Clifford Olson in Canada. And they finally put him away. But he had been captured numerous times and then let go. And in fact, one of the things he was doing, literally driving bolts through the heads of children while they were still alive, pain threshold experiments. Pain threshold experiments were at the cutting edge of all the Nazi and MK Ultra research in Canada, especially because Canada was a big testing ground for a lot of this stuff. And as part of that, I'll show you the only picture ever published in Canada, in the corporate media, of dead children in a residential school is this one. It's from an incident that took place in January 1937 at the Catholic Lejac Residential School and Indian Hospital in northern British Columbia. Now, the spin is that these children tried to run away. You see, they're dressed in winter clothing, and they froze to death trying to get home to their parents. In fact, and I've got this all in murderbydecree.com. You can view this in chapter 1 of my book. The guy who investigated was the Dr. Pitts, Charles Pitts, and his parents had run residential schools. And Charles Pitts wrote, January 4th, 1937, these children were found naked in their underwear in the snow. And I cannot support a claim that they were trying to get home to their parents. It doesn't fit with the evidence. 2 days later, after the official inquiries happens, he says, no, they were fully clothed. They were trying to get home to their parents. So whether somebody put a gun in his mouth or whatever, he switches his story in 48 hours. In fact, what happened with these children was that they were part of pain threshold experiments in these hospitals. Like the Nazis did. You read about this at Auschwitz and other places. They take Russian prisoners of war, strip them naked, throw them out in the snow, and see how long they last. In order to see the limits of human endurance to cold for military application, for their soldiers when they're in the winter and that kind of thing. So it came out of that. But it's the only picture that's ever been allowed into the Canadian press about dead children, and it's a doctored photo to cover up basically an early, pain threshold experiments that MK Ultra was really all about. They were experimental. They weren't just creating sleeper assassins and spies and that. They were probing the limits of the human brain. And that's another part of this that I wanted to show you. At a place called the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, this is on military land, set up in conjunction with the churches that ran these residential schools. We went there in 2012 with a survivor. Now, his name is Kenny Quatel. He was one of the first Native people I met in Port Alberni. And Kenny had been, at a young age, he was being worked on in a hospital for spinal bifida. They drug him, take him out of the hospital. They tell his family that he died on the operating table. Then they take him off to the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, where he was held for 9 years in this one hospital. And under hypnosis and with a psychic investigator present, who was police accredited, she had been used in finding children in that. He helped draw this. And these are our notes. And he said he viewed, that's a probe going up the nostril into the midbrain area of the brain. It's like the early lobotomies where they would go in under the eyeball here and stick a probe in, destroy all the ganglia, separate all the nerves here in the midbrain area to see. Well, in the words of the psychic investigator, this is what she says: the aim was to destroy critical thinking and emotional responses. They're frozen and incapacitated, numbing and immobilizing people into a detached yet functional state. So in other words, they're like machines. They don't have, you can't think critically, you can't have your normal emotion. Everything that makes us human, severed right there through these experiments. And that was really getting closer to the purpose of these MKUltra experiments, how to create a population of robots. And there are 4 stages, and I want to talk about the stages historically of how this developed to the present day. But we can get onto that maybe in a bit. But.
Yeah, let's please do that. But before we do that, you know, as I'm listening to what you were saying, that's kind of thing what these people's sick minds reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer, because he was trying to drill people's, move things around in people's brains and put things in people's brains and pick up people's brains to control them, wasn't he? To make them kind of, they would still be alive, so they wouldn't leave him. That was their thing. Don't leave me. Stay. Have another beer. And he thought he could just create these zombies that would be with him and not leave him.
Well, you know, the old adage, if you're abused, you abuse others. Okay, so Clifford Olson, Jeffrey Dahmer, all these guys are survivors of these experiments. They saw children getting drilled like that. They saw live experiments, vivisection, all these other things on children. So they began to do it themselves, but they were deliberately released into the population as well. It's part of, as we, you know, a lot of people know now, you got to keep the human brain frequency in a state of panic and fear all the time, more easily conditioned that way. And I mean, just look around us, right?
Yeah. So what are the 4 stages then, please?
Okay. So in the early periods, so we're talking like 1930s to the 60s, it's the crudest form of mind control. It's surgical. So things like lobotomies, that's where they began to come into vogue. I don't know if you saw, there was a movie with Jessica Lange called Frances, Frances, about a Hollywood actress in the 30s called Frances Farmer. And she was quite militant in her politics, and she challenged kind of the movie mogul system in Hollywood. She was always outspoken about Nazism and all this stuff. So they targeted her. They arranged a car accident where she was arrested. She had a drinking problem, so they arrested her for being under the influence. They take her to a hospital called Steilacoom. This is a mental asylum in Seattle, near Seattle, in northwest coast of the U.S., right near Vancouver, actually. And did you see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? You know, the movie with Jack Nicholson?
And I've read the book, yes.
Ken Kesey worked at Steilacoom, and it was the place where Jose Delgado developed the first lobotomy experiments. I mean, they'd have people sitting in a circle, drugged, and he'd be going around with a pick going boom, 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 and lobotomizing a dozen people in 5 minutes, right? And Ooh. That's what they did with Frances. They lobotomized her, and she ended up a complete vegetable. And they broadcast that all over as if to say, which they always do, look what, you know, if you guys get out of line, look what we're going to do to you, right? And so that was the early stage of surgical, also through hypnosis, electric shock and stuff like that. Okay, those methods. But after that, by the time of the 60s, and again, don't forget, the CIA introduced LSD into the general population through, they ran houses of prostitution where they would pay prostitutes to lace the drugs of their clients with LSD, and then with a two-way mirror they'd film it to see the reaction. And LSD was developed by Nazi scientists at Fort Detrick and at Montauk on Long Island as part of a mind control drug, you know, to interrogate people, but also, you know, all these other purposes. And they found, okay, chemical methods work better than surgical. But they only worked in a majority of the population, but it didn't take. Drugs like, there was an early version of the rape drug called Largactil. And in fact, in documents out of the Indian Affairs Archives, I found references to the use of these drugs in the residential schools and hospitals. Largactil would reduce people to a state of semi-zombie-like state. There was a more refined version called chlorpromazine, which they still use in psych hospitals and that, to reduce people to a state of, like we said earlier, disinterest and unconsciousness, even though you're awake. Okay, but those methods don't work on everybody because they're chemically based. And the third method they came up with, which is far more effective and is used now a lot, is the electronic. Because don't forget, our minds, just like our bodies, according to quantum physics, we're all just energy waves. And every memory, every thought, every feeling we have exerts a certain frequency. As a matter of fact, it's called a Schumann resonance. You might have read about this. It's the natural frequency of the Earth. It's 7.83 hertz. That's the frequency of the human brain. We're in tune with Mother Earth, naturally. But you can manipulate that. And for example, 7.83 hertz, the average hertz in the city is 60. So living in the city, you're ramped up to an unnatural state of, and then being on the iPads and that, it's even more unnatural because you're bombarded constantly. So the electronic means you can beam that certain, any motion, any thought, you can beam it at people and affect their thoughts electronically. And in fact, they find that it works in over 98% of people, but with a certain percentage, it doesn't work. And I've got my own theories about what that is. It has to do with kind of more questions of spirituality and soul, in that there's a certain number of us who aren't affected by even that. But the fourth stage, which is more serious, is it's what we're experiencing now, and it's systemic. It's how to incorporate the human psyche and being into a big electronic matrix where we actually don't own our minds anymore, or a component, if you like. And that's what, you know, I think we're dealing with now. But as part of that, could you put on the screen the images of that Dr. Wilder Penfield? Because I want to give you a specific example of who developed this stuff.
Yeah, was that the first image at the top of the email?
Yeah, there are a couple of them of him, actually. That's him. He was a Nobel laureate. He worked out of Canada at this next photo, which is the Montreal Neurological Institute, actually connected to what's called the Allen Memorial Institute. Yeah, that's Penfield. He was a guy who developed through brain surgery. He could stimulate part of the brain, and the person would hear music from their childhood that recover certain memories. So he was probing on how to control those aspects of the brain. He was one of the major recipients of CIA money. And there was an eyewitness who I sent you the picture of as well, Ann Diamond. She was a friend of mine. That's her name was Ann McAllister originally. She was an early victim of MK Ultra. That's her. She's written a great book called My Cold War by Ann Diamond. She's a Montreal writer. And she and her twin brother were taken in and used by Ewan Cameron and Wilder Penfield. Now, Anne first connected with me when she heard my work. We've known each other over 20 years. She said when she was a little girl, she was brought in, and there was Dr. Wilder Penfield, this so-called Nobel laureate. And there they had just brought in cages of children, and most of them were Aboriginal. And she learned that they had been brought from the local reservation where the tribal council chief literally sold their own children to the government for these experiments. And she saw Penfield take these kids out experimental on. She said she even saw him strangle one of the children to death when he was fighting and resisting being used. And they were being created, just had a lot of neural and chemical research done on them to see, you know, as part of the MK experiments, how do you wipe out a personality and recreate it? That was kind of the research aim. And so, you know, like I say, it's funny, when I was talking to Anne the first time, she said, I can ride on a bus and spot survivors. It's a look in their eyes. I can just, we know each other when we see it. And she said, there's a lot of us walking around, but they usually just end up on the street, you know, drink themselves to death or whatever, but they're all the living witnesses to these things, right?
Yeah. Let's just go over this a bit more slowly then.
Yeah.
Because we've got phronology was kind of the precursor for this, and let me just show some images, some of the phronology images. So, you know, this is from the 1800s. I think it started in the 1700s, but they've got the brain parts mapped out. And that's a numbered one, but let me show you this one. So they've got all these different parts of the brain. Adhesiveness is one. We've got alimentiveness, amativeness, acquisitiveness, causality, cautiousness, combativeness, concentrativeness, constructiveness, destructiveness, ideality, love of life, philoprogenitiveness, and secretiveness. And they thought that the size of the skull. Can you expand on phronology, Kevin?
Well, as much as I know about it, it was the belief that the shape of the human skull and that was an indicator of intelligence, predilection to do crimes. It was believed that criminals had a different shaped skull and mind, and you had to work on their mind to make them not criminals anymore. And this led into a lot of eugenics theories, which has said, well, for example, Negroes have a smaller skull on average, therefore they're dumber. And of course, Northern Europeans, so-called Aryans, had the biggest skull and brain of all. It was tied into that eugenics argument that you had to eliminate people from the population, the mentally retarded. For example, in America, there's a good book, War Against the Weak, by Edwin Black, where he shows that the movement to create a master race began in America, went over to Nazi Germany, went back after the war, kind of back and forth. But Edwin Black in his book describes exactly that, how the early sterilization laws in 38 of the 50 states said if you had a child who was born with a low IQ, automatic sterilization, couldn't allow them to breed. All the sterilization laws in Canada that were passed right at the same time the Nazis were in power. That's how a lot of Native children got sterilized in the Indian schools and hospitals. Virginia Baptiste, one of the eyewitnesses, said she spoke her language, she got a red tag, had to go lie under the x-ray machine, got sterilized. Her brother, and relatives who wouldn't go to church on Sunday got sterilized. It was a law in Canada, you could do that. So, well, not a law, but an act of the crown, order in council, passed secretly. So, I mean, it was part of that idea that you could determine everything by the size, the shape of the human skull, right?
Yeah, so they'd allocated parts of the brain that they thought did this and that.
Right.
And then MK Ultra came along, and you've got stage one, where they're targeting parts of the brain. Is that what you said earlier?
Yeah, well, of course, this was kind of what you're looking at was kind of a cruder 19th century thing. They found out a lot more about where, like that Dr. Penfield, who we showed, his whole thing was to find out what areas of the brain are responsible for what. And fairly soon they found out that the midbrain area is the one that was primarily responsible for critical thinking, the ability to have a will, a personality of your own, to be able to question things, question authority, say, okay, they say something, but is it true or not? Instead of just blandly accepting, what's official as the truth. All of that area is in the midbrain part, and that's the area they definitely targeted, right, for all these experiments.
And in this first stage, where did they select the people from that they experimented on?
Prisoners. It wasn't just children, but which they got. The churches had a program all over the world of providing children in return for funding to various drug companies, but also the military, the government, and prisoners, military personnel, like Ann Diamond and her brother were both children of a soldier in the Canadian Army. So military children are pre-adapted, following orders, having a stern domestic environment, more easily used. Native children, of course, were deliberately violated and consistently in these places, sexually and every other way, in order to create multiple personalities. Because if you're traumatized enough, especially at a young age, at a pre-verbal age, you tend to dissociate into multiple personalities. Perfect. That's exactly what they needed for these experiments. So it was all designed deliberately to create this traumatized personality who are then more easily manipulated. Right?
So we've got 1,000 people watching live presently across all platforms. All of Kevin's links are in the description box, his books, his other broadcasts, etc. Please support his important work. We're talking about the different stages of MK Ultra. So if you have got any questions pertaining to mind control, whether it's royal, Vatican, military, etc., please put them in the chat. Please stick on the subject. And the first stage, they were going in the brain and poking around and doing stuff to the brain. What was the second stage again, Kevin?
Chemical. So in the drug culture in the 50s and 60s, developing drugs like chlorpromazine, largactil, the things that would suppress consciousness and the capacity to act on conviction. And, it's called the limbic system in the brain. It's one of the unique things that even primates don't have. And in the human evolution, in the brain evolution, us people develop this limbic area, which is empathy. It's compassion. It's like when somebody's down on the ground, you run over and help them. I mean, that area. And it's interesting because in psychopaths and sociopaths, that area of the brain is not really developed at all. It's the thing that keeps us human. Well, that was part of the midbrain area that was targeted, because they can literally get people who love one another to turn on each other and become aggressive. And a lot of the research over the last 50 plus years has been developing those chemical means to separate us from our normal personalities and the things that bond people together. And that's the chemical phase, which was quite huge, massive funding.
So would you say that, on one coast we had Timothy Leary, on the other coast, you referenced Ken Kesey earlier. Would you say that they were two of the principals, conduits through which the CIA flooded America with LSD?
Well, I don't know about Ken Kesey.